Thank you. Thank you very much. I just posted a couple of days ago on where I actually am very lucky to the intersection of three different businesses. I'm a teacher first, I love to write, and I'm in finance. And the way I described it, I'm in three businesses that are all begging to be disrupted. Three really big, badly run businesses, all of which need to be taken to the cleaners. So I've made it my objective at this point in my life to disrupt the businesses I'm in. And this is one of those acts of disruption, because I think for too long we've thought about teaching as being classrooms in universities, but I don't see that restriction anymore. So what I'd like to talk about is actually what I've been teaching for 30 years. To give you some background, I came to NYU in 1986. And when I first came to NYU, they gave me a class to teach. It was called Security Analysis. And for those of you who know the history of that class, it was a class that Ben Graham taught at Columbia in the 1950s that you know who, he who shall not be named, took. And it's a class with a long and hoary tradition. So they handed it to me and said, you got to teach this class. I took one look at the class and said, no way. This is the most boring piece, a collection of topics I can think of, because by the 1980s it was showing its age. So I went to the head of the department and said, I'd like to teach a valuation class. And he said, don't do it. There isn't enough stuff in valuation to actually teach a class. And you know what? In 1986, there wasn't enough stuff in valuation. There were no books in valuation. In fact, when I did my MBA, which was way, way, way back in time, 1979 through 81, 2 years of the program, we spent about an hour and a half collectively on valuation. So I thought about it and I said, I'd really like to teach the class, and I considered two options. One is to go the official route in the university, which is to ask officially for the class to be okayed. And if you've ever been in an academic setting, as most of you have, you know how difficult it is to get things done officially at a university. A committee will be formed to report to another subcommittee, and by the time they get back to you, you'd be ready to retire. So I discovered early on in my academic life that if you want to get something done, it's best to do it subversively. So here's what I did. I said, okay, I'll teach a security analysis class. And I went into the classroom and I taught a valuation class. They have absolutely no idea what I do in the classroom. I mean, I could be teaching cooking for all they know, right? So you know how long it took them to find out? In 2008, I got a call from the dean's office. This is 22 years after I've been teaching this class, saying, we've heard you're teaching a valuation class. And I said, yes, I've been doing it for 22 years. They said, we should call it valuation. I said, welcome to reality. So if you look at the NYU schedule, you won't see valuation until 2008, but that's because I've hijacked like 6 other classes in previous iterations and made them all valuation classes. I'm fascinated by valuation, but I'll tell you up front what I think about valuation. I think valuation is simple. Fundamentally, anybody can do valuation. I think we choose to make it complex. Who's we? The people who practice valuation. Why? Because that's how you make a living. You've got to cover things up with layers of complexity, keep people away. So I want to get back to basics. Obviously, in 40 minutes, I'm not going to cover the details of valuation, but I want to kind of hit some points that I think sometimes get missed, especially when people look at valuation from the outside. So here's the first message I want to deliver. Valuation is not accounting. And the reason I say that is most people, if you say valuation, think numbers, think accounting statements, think income, balance sheets. Valuation is not accounting. And it's actually a task I face every year I teach this class. In fact, many of the MBAs that I teach come into my class in the first year in the spring semester. When they come in the spring semester, they've taken one class in accounting. And if you've looked at how MBA programs have evolved, MBA programs are very diverse now. I get museum directors, I get basketball players. So to them, the only sense of finance they've had is the accounting class. And part of my job is to get them out of the accounting mindset. So let me start off by explaining the way I see the difference between how accountants look at the world and how finance looks at the world. Accounting is backward looking. Nothing bad about that. So nothing I say should be viewed as bad. It's their job to record what's happened. So if you look at a balance sheet, and most of you, if you open up a 10K or an annual report, will see a balance sheet. This is a classic accounting balance sheet. So let me look at the breakdown of how accountants break down a company. On the asset side, they break assets down into current assets, basically inventory, accounts receivable, cash. Fixed assets, land, building, equipment. Accountants are big on tangible fixed assets. For some reason, if they can see it, they're much more comfortable with it. Then you have financial assets, investments in other companies. And then you have what accountants euphemistically like to call intangible assets. Now, if I went around this room and asked people to name intangible assets, you'd see lots of things come to the surface, brand name, technology. But if you look at an accounting balance sheet, you know what the most common intangible asset is? Goodwill. And let's be completely clear about this. Goodwill is the most useless asset known to man. And here's what. For goodwill to manifest itself on an accounting balance sheet, you know what a company has to do? It has to acquire another company. So if you're the greatest company on the face of the earth and you've grown entirely with internal investments, there will be no goodwill on your balance sheet. Period. The minute you do an acquisition, goodwill pops up. And here's why it pops up. You acquire a company, it has a book value of $4 billion. So what did the accountants say until just before you acquired it? It's worth $4 billion, it's worth $4 billion, you offer $10 billion. The accountant has a $6 billion problem to explain away, right? So you know what he does? He calls it goodwill, he puts it on the balance sheet, and he has to do it because the balance sheet has this very unpleasant requirement. It has to balance. Goodwill is a plug variable. The problem with goodwill is it sounds good. And when something sounds good, people feel the urge to pay for it. So every week I get emails from people saying, I'm valuing this company, it has $5 billion in goodwill, how much should I pay for it? And my response is, it's a plug variable. What the heck are you doing paying for a plug variable? On the other side of the balance sheet, again, accountants get carried away. You have current liabilities, accounts payable, supplier credit, deferred taxes, so all kinds of stuff. Then you've got long-term liabilities, bank loans, corporate bonds, and then you have an item that's called shareholders' equity. If you get a chance, take Google, look at the balance sheet. There will be a shareholders' equity number. Take any company, there's a shareholders' equity number. You know what goes into it? Everything that's happened to this company over its lifetime. Think about it. When you look at the shareholders' equity for Coca-Cola, in that number is the original public offering that Coca-Cola made, which was what, 100 years ago? And everything that has happened since. The shareholders' equity is a reflection of the past. So here's what I'm going to do first. I'm going to replace it with what I prefer to look at a company as, a financial balance sheet. And at some level, a financial balance sheet is far simpler than an accounting balance sheet. At another level, it's far more complex. Look at the asset side of the balance sheet. There are only two items. Assets in place and growth assets. Let's take the easier half of that. Assets in place are investments you've already made as a company. That's pretty straightforward, right? It's the value of investments you've already made. Pick any company you want, think about the investments they've already made. Growth assets is a little messier. It's a value I'm attaching to investments I expect you to make next year, 2 years out, 5 years out, 10 years out, forever. I'm giving you credit for investments you haven't even thought about yet. It's pretty scary, right? An accountant can never do that, but I play by no rules. So if I feel that you have great investments in the future, I can give you a large value. Let's look at a contrast. You look at Procter & Gamble. Where's most of the value for the company coming from? Investments they've already made or growth assets? Most of the stuff they've done is already on the ground. What else are they going to do? But if you look at a LinkedIn, and you can pick any young growth company, and I'm not going to pick them in terms of quality. Just think of any young growth company. On a good day, maybe LinkedIn's assets in place are worth $1 billion because they made about $10 million in operating income last year. You're paying $40 billion for the company. The extra $39 billion is for what? Expectations, perceptions, hopes. Nothing wrong with it. But that's a first stop when you're an investor. You've got to stop and do a reality check. What are you buying when you buy this company? Because the way you assess the company is going to be very different if it's Procter & Gamble as opposed to LinkedIn. If you're Procter & Gamble, you should be very focused on earnings reports and say, how much did they make last year? If you're LinkedIn, who cares what they made last year? That's why when I see investors freak out over earnings reports from young companies, and there are lots of them, right? Take any social media company. Look at how they freak out. Earnings per share were 2 cents below expectations. I don't care, because the value of your company is not coming from what you did last year, it's coming from what I think you can do in the future.